Hello, I'm Dr. Angie McCartney.
And I'm Ruth McCartney.
Welcome to TeaFlix,
where each episode's intimate conversation features a fascinating guest across the spectrum of Beatles world, pop culture, Grammy winners, the music industry, chefs, producers, music stars, actors, and more. So bottoms up and join us as they spill the tea on TeaFlix. And apparently, according to Zuckerberg, we are live.
We hope so anyway.
We're alive.
Hello,
once
everybody.
again.
Good morning. Greetings. Welcome back, folks.
Happy Tuesday.
Thank you. Hope you all survived the last week.
Yep.
Fingers crossed. Never mind.
Yep.
Chin up. Yeah.
Exactly. So today we are delighted once again to have a second time guest, which is a very, very rare thing for TeaFlix. Our friend from recently snowed upon New Orleans, which I'm sure we'll touch on, Bruce Spizer, whose books tell the fascinating and sometimes convoluted stories behind the Beatles' vinyl releases. Each book is filled with images of 45 RPM discs, album covers, labels, posters, rare memorabilia. It's really like a museum in your hands. He's clipped magazine ads, company documents, and of course, pictures of the Fabs themselves. Many of them are from Bruce's extensive Beatles collection, and others were contributed by his really fascinating network, worldwide network of top Beatles collectors and dealers. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, all the way live from New Orleans, please welcome Bruce Spizer.
Hello.
It's glad to be here. And we had 10 inches of snow right outside my house.
Oh, my God.
In New Orleans, a tropical area. It was the most snow in over 150 years for New Orleans.
Wow.
It was quite something. I walked out on the golf course at a park where my house is one house away, and you could see how deep the snow was. Took some beautiful pictures out there, had a lot of fun, and after about 20 or 30 minutes, because I didn't have the proper gloves, my hands were quite cold, so I went in for a spell, went back out for a spell, but it snowed from about 9 in the morning till about 5:30 that evening.
Really?
It reminded me of when I used to go skiing in Colorado. It was that same type of powdery snow.
Oh,
really beautiful.
yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I saw
It's
somebody
beautiful to look at. Yeah.
Somebody put a lovely a meme on Instagram outside the Café du Monde covered in snow.
Yeah.
And it says, when you ask for that extra powdered sugar on your beignet.
You got it. Yeah.
It's finally started to melt, but I still had a patch of the snow was on Tuesday, and I still had a little bit of snow on my front lawn as late as Sunday.
Good grief.
Yeah, it was pretty wild. I couldn't go to work because there was a bunch of ice in front of the building that I worked in. And when I talked to the building manager on Thursday, he said, "Nah, wait till Friday."
Wow.
And the other thing about it was because of that, I couldn't practice law. So I stayed at home working on my next Beatles book, and I got a lot done. So it worked out.
Excuse.
Well, you see, it might have been a little early New Year John Lennon sprinkling or a George Harrison gift for you to stay home.
It worked out. It worked out fine. Thank you.
That's great. And just for our viewers, to explain your Billy Preston psychedelic face makeup, face tattoo. You haven't had the Mike Tyson tattoos, I take it.
No, the Venetian blinds in my office are partially open. And when I went to try to completely shut them down, the tool that you used to do that broke off.
Oh, lovely.
It's kind of a zebra effect. I should not be confused with NFL referees, affectionately known as zebras, however.
Yeah.
That's right, or stripy horses, as I used to call them when I was a kid.
Yes.
Now, let me tell you this. Stephen Wilson, who is your publisher and mine, asked us if we could get in touch again because I believe you've got some more books.
Yes.
Published by Imagine and Wonder.
Yes.
So what's going on?
Well, the thing right now is that Steve has put together a package of the first 5 books that I did in my Beatles album series in paperback, and that would include a book on Sgt. Pepper, which was going to be a one-off book. And after I did it, people were like, "Well, Bruce, you have to do a book on, the Beatles' White Album." And I said, "Well, sure, that's my favorite album."
Yes.
So I did that book, and then it was like, well, how can you not do a book on Abbey Road?
Oh boy.
And then I was working on a book on Let It Be. And because the Let It Be project was delayed so many times in real time back in the 60s, I finally called that book The Beatles Finally Let It Be. And that book was going to come out, during the anniversary for that album. And all of a sudden COVID hit and everything pretty much went to a standstill. But fortunately, I soldiered on with the book and got it out in time. And then Steve, got his out a little bit, the paperback editions a little bit thereafter. And then finally, a book covering Yellow Submarine and Magical Mystery Tour.
Oh, great.
Now, all these books have been done originally in hardcover. And then I had Steve pick up the paperback, publishing and rights on them. And it's worked out kind of fun that way. So the series has continued in hardcover, and eventually we may get them over to paper. But the next book in the series I did was on Rubber Soul and Revolver, and that was a really fascinating one to do. Mm-hmm. And people said, well, couldn't you do a separate book on each album? Of course you could. But George had always viewed them as kind of like bookends. And also, the thing about it was the way the albums were released in the U.S., it made sense to do a single book. And the way the book works is I'll have a chapter on what went on in the United Kingdom, what went on in the United States.
Great.
So because I'm covering both, that meant that my Rubber Soul Revolver book covered both versions of Rubber Soul. Of course, it had to have the U.S. album Yesterday and Today, which kind of bridged Rubber Soul and Revolver, and that meant the Butcher cover. Yeah. And I did like about a 45-page chapter on the Butcher cover, which many people said that alone was worth the price of the book.
Yeah, wow. I'm sure.
So I did that, and then I went back through the sea of time and decided, well, we've got to hit the earlier albums. So that meant Please Please Me to With the Beatles. And in the U.S., of course, that meant Meet the Beatles and Introducing the Beatles. Oh. And then finally, my most recent book out there covers A Hard Day's Night, which once again meant the UK and US albums, but also the US albums, the Beatles' second album and Something New. And the one that I worked on while I was snowed under is going to cover Beatles for Sale to Help. And that means in the US, Beatles 65, Beatles 6 in the Help soundtrack album. And I was relieved to find out when I sat down with my wonderful graphic designer, Diana Thornton, who has been with me I think it's 27 years now that I've been doing these Beatle books. And, we're like a team for 27 years. And when we did the page thing and putting everything in order, it's the exact same page count as the past two books, which means it will make it a lot easier for the printer and I to coordinate. Yeah.
Well,
so, and that book will be coming out this summer. It'll be coming out this summer. Great. And it'll be available through my website, which is very easy to remember. It's just Beatle, BEATLE.net, N-E-T. Can't get any easier than that.
That's right. How did you get that domain name? How long have you had it?
I've had that domain name now for about 28 years. And it was a funny story where when I started, the whole story of, doing a book on the Beatles was kind of crazy. I finished settling a big ERISA retirement plan class action lawsuit where I got a bunch of retirees their money back who have been screwed out of their retirements by their employer. And, and I thought, well, I recently had noticed, this could only happen in New Orleans, that roaches had attacked the spines of my Beatle albums. They left the Beach Boys alone. They left ABBA alone. They attacked every Beatles album and chewed away on the cardboard spines, with the exception of Meet the Beatles. They left that one alone.
How funny.
And so when I started looking into these earlier albums and wanted to replace them, I would do a little bit of reading up on them. And what I was reading in books didn't make any sense to me. And when I talked to dealers and collectors, they'd say, oh, it's in every book. And being an attorney, I thought, what if every book's wrong? I went ahead and did original research and found that pretty much everything written about the early Beatle albums in America was in many cases, incorrect. And so I came out with a book called The Beatles Records on VJ. And it was going to be a one-off footnote in Beatles history, my one book. And the book came out, and people were like, "Well, when's your Capitol book coming out?"
Oh,
And I'm
boy.
like, "Oh, okay." So I started working on the Capitol books, and then people were like, "And of course, you have to do a book on Apple." And you're all right. So the next thing I know, it's a whole series of books on the various record labels that the Beatles came out in America. And then when we were getting near the 40th anniversary of the Beatles in America, I was thinking maybe I should do some book on that. It's such a convoluted story. And this will remind you, it's sort of like when Paul was coming back from America, going back to England, and thinking about this Magical Mystery Tour project. And he kind of outlined it on the plane and all, and got back and started working on that. Well, in my situation, I had been to Los Angeles for a Beatles convention.
Mhm.
And prior to it, I'd met with a woman who used to work for VJ Records.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
She was a controller of the company, and she had saved everything, put it in storage rather than throwing it out. And so I met with her, and she had another box or two of goodies for me to go through. And I went through them, and I found this telegram, and it was from VJ Records to a company called Concertone Music, a publishing company. And on it, it said, "Please Please Me" by the Beatles, and Beatles was spelled with 2 T's, incorrectly, of course. "Please Please Me" by the Beatles will be released February 7, 1963. And I began thinking, the Beatles arrived in America on February 7, 1964.
Yeah.
And I had this idea, and I started taking a few notes on the plane, and I said, "Open book with Beatles arriving in America on February 7, 1964.
Yep.
Discuss press conference, have them at the plaza watching themselves on TV, which they show in the Maisel Brothers film,
Yep.
on CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite."
Yeah.
Yep.
Then Walter Cronkite would always sound off with, "And that's the way it is,
Yeah.
Friday, February 7, 1960, 4. And I thought, I'll open the book with that, and then I'll go back in time 1 year to that record being released and explain, how that record ended up on VJ, and move
Yes.
forward all the way to the Beatles arriving in America again, and then take the book to the end when they head back. And I outlined all of that on the airplane. And then in my naive little mind, I wrote a little question, and I wrote, "Interview Walter Cronkite, ? Get Cronkite to do forward, ? And I'm proud to say that I was able to interview Walter Cronkite
Really?
forward to the book. And the
Great.
book is called The Beatles Are Coming, The Birth of Beatlemania in America. It is my favorite book that I've ever done. And I tell people, when I did the book, I interviewed 3 of my childhood heroes, and like, "Oh my God, you got to interview George and Ringo and Paul?" I said, "No, I interviewed Walter Cronkite, Edwin Newman, and Mike Wallace."
Wow.
Wow.
Those reporters,
That's quite something, though, isn't it?
yeah, they were instrumental in Beatlemania exploding the way it did in America.
Yeah.
That people had never really put together. It was a very strange thing.
Were any of them self-confessed Beatle fans? Did you even touch on that, or did you just
Well,
stay on the media?
Walter Cronkite summed it up best saying, "I hope you're not offended by this, but I was not a Beatlemaniac in any way." And I said, "Well, Mr. Cronkite, what type of music do you like?" And he says, "Dixieland jazz." And I said, "Mr. Cronkite, I'm from New Orleans, and I can assure you I love Dixieland jazz." And we had a great interview, but it was a little bit strange. And some people may have heard me tell this story, but I don't tell it that often. And what happened was, in preparing to interview Mr. Cronkite, I got this DVD called Cronkite Remembers. And when I reviewed the DVD, there was a section when he talked about the Beatles.
Uh-huh.
So we started off the interview. It was a phone interview. And Mr. Cronkite is very funny at the beginning. He says, "You'll have to speak very loudly because the phone connection's not very good up here." And then he laughed and he said, "Actually, it's my hearing that's not very good." So at that point, I relaxed, and I told him I had reviewed Cronkite Remembers. And I said, and in it, you mentioned it being a little known fact that Ed Sullivan had learned about the Beatles from a broadcast on the CBS Evening News. Mr. Cronkite goes, yes, that's correct. And then I thought, oh, my God. I said, Mr. Cronkite, in all due respect, that is not correct. And rather than hearing click or who the F do you think you are, I'm Walter effing Cronkite.
Right.
Said, oh, why do you say that?
Wow.
Because Mr. Cronkite, being the consummate newsman, maybe this guy's onto something. And if he is, I want to know why.
Yeah.
So I explained to Mr. Cronkite that I had obtained copies of Brian Epstein's appointment book for the month of November 1963. Mm-hmm. And in that appointment book, he met with Ed Sullivan at the Delmonica Hotel on November 11th and 12th.
Yeah.
And Mr. Cronkite said, yes, Ed was, that's where Ed lived. That makes sense. And I said to Mr. Cronkite, your story on the CBS Evening News was not broadcast till December 10th. I said, a month later. And he says, well, could that story have been broadcast earlier? And I said, well, Mr. Cronkite, it was broadcast earlier on the morning news with Mike Wallace. And he said, well, when would that be? And he said, because we normally would broadcast the feature stories the same day.
Yeah.
And I said, well, that was November 22nd, 1963. And Mr. Cronkite said, oh, my, of course, we wouldn't have run a feature story on the evening President Kennedy was assassinated.
No, of course.
And so he said, well, is it possible that I ran it on the evening news before that? And I said, no, Mr. Cronkite, because there's footage of the Beatles performing in Bournemouth, England, that was shot on November 15th, a few days after Ed Sullivan and Brian Epstein met.
Right.
And so he says, oh, my, well, I see you've proven that. He says, but I remember getting off the set and immediately getting a phone call from Ed, who was very excited, meaning Ed Sullivan, saying, Walter, what can you tell me about those bugs or whatever they call themselves?
Bugs.
Mr. Cronkite, I don't doubt for a second that happened exactly as you remember. I said, but you misinterpreted the phone call. What actually happened was Ed Sullivan had booked the Beatles a month earlier, and having done so, knew it was a gamble because the Beatles were virtually unknown in America.
Yeah, of course.
And a month later, he's watching the CBS Evening News and you end your broadcast with a 4-minute plus story on the Beatles. So, of course, he's all excited and wants to learn more about this group. And I said, as far as not remembering the name, you know Ed was bad with names. And Mr. Cronkite laughed and he said, oh, Ed was terrible with names. And, of course, the one that I remember most as a kid was he had the Supremes on his show and he goes, ladies and gentlemen, the girls, because he couldn't think of their names.
Oh, my God.
So,
that is
wonderful
fascinating.
story.
But the reason that, as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the reason that Brian Epstein was able to meet on November 11th and 12th was because he had been given Ed Sullivan's business card by Ed Sullivan in London at a foggy airport when they were all stuck in the lounge.
you know, that's a story that's just not true.
Really?
It's been told so many times by so many people that everyone assumed it to be true. And I mentioned a shortened version of that in the book, The Beatles Are Coming, but I later concluded that Ed Sullivan was not in London on October 31st when the Beatles arrived back from this tour. And the reason I kind of put that together was I started getting suspicious when I talked to Vince Calandra, who was with the Sullivan Show. And what Vince told me was it was extremely rare for Ed to go out of town when they were in production.
Right.
Going to London would be problematic. The other thing I did was I reviewed copies of Ed Sullivan's newspaper column in New York called The Talk of the Town.
Right.
And in it, he would mention things that he and his wife were doing.
Right.
In October and early November, there was no mention of being in London for any reason.
Oh.
Then I talked to Peter Prichard, who worked for Lou Grade in the UK and was Ed Sullivan's talent scout for Europe. And Peter Prichard said, well, Bruce, that story's been told over and over and over again. And I said, well, but is it true? And he said, well, I'm not saying it's true and I'm not saying it's false. He didn't want to let the cat out of the bag, I guess. That PR thing that CBS or Sullivan's person had come up with. But it was not true. And Peter said, what I can tell you is that before Brian went to the United States, I talked to him and I told Brian, you really need to get the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. That's the U.S. equivalent of Saturday night at the London Palladium.
Sure.
And of course, that meant a lot to Brian. And also, I think Lou Harrison had even told Brian, you want to get them on the Ed Sullivan Show. So Peter said, look, I can go ahead and negotiate a deal for you. And Brian told Peter, no, I like to negotiate my own deals, but could you set up a meeting? And Peter Prichard was the one who set up the meeting between Brian and Ed Sullivan.
How awful for Peter all these years, if even to our family, that's what we believe. That's what my dad believed.
Everyone believed it. And the other thing that worked out well, one of the people that I had wanted to interview for my book, but he absolutely was not doing any more interviews, was a guy named Bob Preck. And Bob Preck was the show's producer, the Sullivan Show's producer.
Oh, yeah.
And as it turned out, I was doing a book fair in Maryland, and the woman who was putting the book fair together for a school there told me that her dad was Bob Preck. And so I said, well, of course, I said, here is a copy of The Beatles Are Coming. Please send it to your father. And about a year later, I get a call from someone, Bruce Spizer. I said, yes, this is Bob Preck. I said, he says, do you know who I am? I said, oh, yes, I do.
Did you stand up?
Well, this is really great hearing from you.
Yeah.
And he said, well, I meant to call you earlier, but my daughter sent me your book, and I read through it. And he says, you nailed it. You got everything right. And I said, well, what about Sullivan, seeing the Beatles and in London? He says, as you kind of suspected, that did not happen. He says, wow, I certainly have no knowledge, and I can't imagine Ed not telling me about a trip he was taking to London while we were in production. So he says, it's safe to assume that Ed was not in London at that time.
I wonder
interesting.
It's like with the Royals now all biting at each other. They've all got PR camps and PR people.
Yeah.
I wonder which PR camp would have thought to sit down and not just tell the truth and say, Brian Epstein's connections and Peter Prichard and whatever, put the opportunity together. I wonder who felt the need to create this fantastical, universal, coincidental fantasy.
Probably a publicist for CBS or the Ed Sullivan Show.
Yeah.
And because Ed Sullivan told it so many times, must be true. I mean, who am I, Bruce Spizer, to doubt Ed Sullivan? Who am I, Bruce Spizer?
You are Bruce Spizer.
I most trusted man in America. He's wrong about something.
Yeah, I know.
Well,
facts show it. And that's the thing. As an attorney, I would never go to court relying on something that someone told me without finding documentation.
Absolutely.
Hearsay doesn't hold up, right?
So that's why it's so important. And when I did my more recent book, The Beatles, Please Please Me to With the Beatles, I always had thought that how Beatlemania exploded in America. And after telling Mr. Cronkite, you weren't the one who set up, the meeting, in effect, I told him, though, you did have a major role in a Beatlemania exploding in America. And he said, oh, what was that? And I said, well, your broadcast on December 10th was watched, of course, by millions of Americans. And two of those people, one, Ed Sullivan saw it. The next day, CBS, a month, more than a month before, almost 2 months before they were going to be on the Sullivan Show, began promoting he was going to have the Beatles on the show. That was unheard of. Yeah. And furthermore, a 15-year-old girl from Silver Springs, Maryland, Marcia Albert, had seen it. And Marcia wrote a letter. They didn't have email in those days to her local DJ, as Chuck Berry would say. And that was Carol James at WWDC, saying that, I saw this group, the Beatles, on the Ed Sullivan Show. Why can't we have music like that in America? Carol James had seen the broadcast. He was impressed. And he thought, I know someone who is a stewardess with BOAC, British Overseas Airways Corporation, or is flew into Miami Beach on BOAC, which is now, of course, British Airways.
That's right.
But, back then, It was BOAC.
I know. I still have my pilot's logbook.
Very cool. And this stewardess, they weren't called flight attendants, and they were called stewardesses.
That's right.
Brought back the latest Beatles single, which was I Want to Hold Your Hand. Capitol Records had planned on releasing that record on January 13th, 1964.
Wow.
However, because it was played on the air, and he invited Marcia Albert down to the station, and she introduces it very nervous and cutely saying, ladies and gentlemen, for the first time in America, here are the Beatles with I Want to Hold Your Hand. And afterwards, Carol James said, write and let us know. Well, kids didn't write. They immediately began calling the stations. Carol James said the switchboard looked like a Christmas tree.
Yeah.
They started putting the song in heavy rotation. He sent a dub of it to DJs he knew in Chicago and St. Louis. And all of a sudden, Carol James gets a call from Walter Hofer, who was Brian Epstein and Capitol's lawyer and EMI's lawyer. And he says, stop playing the record or we're going to get the court to issue an injunction, cease and desist. And Carol James says, are you nuts? It's a hit.
Yeah.
And then Walter Hofer thought, let me report back to Capitol and tell them why are you doing that. So
What a great story.
Stayed up from January 13th to December 26th. Why is that important? And it's extremely important. Let's play things out if that doesn't happen. The record comes out in America in mid-February.
Yep.
By the time the Beatles were on the Sullivan Show, maybe it's a top 10 hit. And by then, maybe the Beatles, rather than Sullivan would always draw between 10, about 20 to 30 million was his normal draw. And so, okay, maybe 30 million tune in to see them. But because the record comes out when it does, here's what happens. What happens the day after Christmas? Kids are not in school. And, of course, they're playing video games. No, they're not. They don't have video games back then. They're listening to the radio.
And also, I think psychologically, having just lost JFK, everybody needed.
We'll get to that in a minute.
Right.
So anyway, they're all excited, because they're hearing this song on the radio that's so fresh and so different. I remember the first time I heard it on the radio.
Do you really?
It was different. And also, so WMCA plays it. WINS and WABC jump on it almost immediately. Wow. And think about it. They're not in school.
Nope.
They have Christmas and Hanukkah money, and mommy and daddy can take them to the record store. And within a week, it's number one on WABC, and the rest of the nation shortly follows. Now, because of that, the Beatles are now news. And when the Beatles land in America on February 7th, it's covered on the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite as a news story.
Yeah.
How many people tune in to Sullivan that night? Not 20 to 30 million, 73 million people.
Jesus.
And that's because that record, the release date was pushed up early. So that first domino I always thought was Walter Cronkite broadcasting that story. In doing my most recent book, researching it, this book, I realized I had missed the first domino. The first domino was a decision made by CBS News. Up until September of 1963, national news was 15 minutes long.
Okay.
But September 1, CBS expanded from 15 to 30 minutes. Why is that important? With 15 extra minutes, it gave them time to do feature stories.
Yeah.
And the morning news with Mike Wallace was doing feature stories, but did not have the budget of the CBS Evening News. So what that meant was they could have their London bureau do a feature story on the Beatles. And if CBS had remained 15 minutes, that story never happens.
Yeah.
So it's amazing how, you think of all the things that had to happen for the Beatles to make it big in America.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk about the Kennedy assassination.
The JFK thing, yeah.
Yeah. I was, at the time, 9 years old. I was in third grade. It was a Friday. Never forget it.
Mm-hmm.
I'll probably tear up when I say this.
Oh.
The teacher walks out the room. And we're kids. It's Friday. You could take a Bic pen in those days, and you could pull out, I have one here, I'm not going to do it, but you could pull out the ink thing, and it
Yeah.
became a pea shooter.
Oh,
And we were shooting spitballs across the room and cutting up like mad. And the teacher had been called, out the room. Walks back into the room about 15 minutes later. White as a ghost. She walks to the blackboard.
oh, baby.
And she writes, "The president is dead. Class dismissed."
Oh,
We all,
Oh,
she couldn't even speak, huh?
no.
we all lowered our heads and cried.
Oh,
Oh, my goodness.
We were young kids, and kids are resilient. And
Yeah.
after a couple of weeks, we were over it, in all due respect to President Kennedy. Now, however, when we heard the Beatles, of course it was fresh and exciting, and of course it uplifted our mood, but it was not cause and effect.
no.
The death of President Kennedy didn't cause me to be a Beatles fan.
No,
No, no, no.
no, but
And-
I think when
and
they
how
came,
do- And how do I hammer home that point?
yeah,
Is this. The Beatles were popular in England, France, Spain, Japan,
Sweden.
South Africa, the
Mhm.
Philippines, Australia, New Zealand, Germany, Scandinavian countries.
Whoa, yeah,
None of those countries had their head of state assassinated.
that's
It
correct.
was not cause and effect. Now, did it lift our spirits? You betcha. But it wasn't cause and effect. The
Yeah.
cause and effect could have been the media, because the media for several weeks is reporting on the Kennedy assassination, civil rights unrest, and
Yeah.
all sorts of horrible news stories. And all of a sudden comes this fun little thing out of England that Walter Cronkite broadcast on the CBS News. And man, this could be a really fun story. And
Yes.
the press jumped on it. If you hated the Beatles, it was fun to mock them. If you loved the Beatles, it was fun to salute them. And I think just as in England, where the press contributed to Beatlemania, the press contributed to Beatlemania in the United States.
Yeah, what I was getting at when I was starting to talk about the timing in JFK, I don't think it was cause and effect either,
No.
but it was a much needed PTSD, psychological, just a 5-minute break,
absolutely.
like a hug. You know what I mean? It's like when the Palisades fires and everybody's going through now. When the food trucks show up and give them free tacos, it's nothing to do with the fire,
Yeah.
the situation, or whatever. It's just it's a diversion, it's a distraction that's a positive instead of
It's a
all
good
this.
news story.
And again,
otherwise,
it's
Oh.
the media. You know, the media are still to this day feeding us the
Yeah.
stuff that scare us out of our brains. Right?
Oh, absolutely. So those are the kind of things that when you do the research, you uncover. It's exciting to uncover it, of course.
Yeah, of course it is.
You feel
Yeah.
like, there was a Beatles dealer. He's still around, a guy named Perry Cox, who's a very well respected Beatles memorabilia dealer.
Yep.
And Perry dubbed me the Columbo of Beatles researchers because, I would talk to Perry about something and he'd say it, and I'd say, okay. And then all of a sudden, say, but Perry, one more thing about, and I kind of trying to go back one more level and see if we could go ahead and find out, well, what caused that type thing.
Right.
And so it's been a lot of fun. And as I tell people, my skills as an attorney and then also as a CPA really made me uniquely qualified to do this type of research writing. Because when I write a book, it's no different than preparing for a lawsuit.
Right.
When you prepare for a lawsuit, you go through what's called discovery. What's discovery? You're reviewing documents and you're interviewing people.
Right.
Then
Yeah.
you have to write it up in a way that people will understand it. What do I do when I write a book? Same thing. I go through discovery. It's called research. You interview people, you review documents.
Yeah.
I have to write it up in a way and present it in an attractive way that people will like it. And also, I've never missed a publishing deadline for my printer. And that's because I would dare not miss a deadline with the judge. I'm disciplined to make a deadline. So it's really worked out well. It's nice when something I was trained for academically, I could use for something fun like writing about the Beatles.
Right. Left brain, right brain working together, right? Like a big old orchestra. So how did you and Stephen Wilson from Imagine and Wonder, and he's got a new website, goldenage60s.com. How did you meet Stephen?
I met Steve a long, long time ago where he was at a Beatles convention and came by my table and he started looking at the books and he was very impressed with them. He was working for some big name publisher. And he said, we need to do something with you sometime. But the publishers he was with, it never really got anywhere. There was a funny story. And I don't know if this was one of the ones he was with. It might have been, or it might have been a publisher he'd recommended to me. And I went to meet with the person and talk about the book. And then he said, well, of course, if you do the book and we, publish this, it was the book, The Beatles Are Coming. I was really excited about the book. It was a done book.
Right.
And I was either going to publish it myself like I did with all my hardcover books or get a major publisher to do it.
Right.
So when he was talking about it, he says, and of course, we'd print it for you. And he says, and of course, we'd have an exclusive on it. And I said, well, could I sell the book on my website? And, well, no, not really. And I said, well, obviously at Beatle conventions, he said, yeah, you could buy some copies from us for that. Right. And I said, wait a minute. I said, I have a master's in business administration. I'm an attorney. I'm a CPA, and I'm giving you a finished product, and you're offering me a deal as if you're funding something, which you're not. All you're doing is, I said, I don't think so. And he said, well, maybe we could do some different terms. And he said, and of course, we're going to need to get an approval letter from Apple before we do the book. And I laughed and I said, you're not going to get an approval letter from Apple. He said, well, then I really don't think we can do this book. And I said, fine, I'll do what I've been doing. For my first, 3 or 4 books, I'll just publish it myself.
Yep.
And that was that. But Steve and I just kept in touch over the years. And when Steve set up his own company, it seemed natural for Steve and I to get together at that time.
Yeah.
He's, good guy. I've known him for decades, since I started doing it. But it was fun because, I'd be at a Beatles convention and somebody would come by the table and thumb through the book. And one guy says, when I did that VJ book, he says, this book isn't really done by a major publisher, is it? And I said, no. And he says, I don't mean that as an insult. And he hands me his card. He was with Random House. And he says, no major publisher would have done the book with that kind of quality because I have color images throughout, not a center plate with a few color images.
Wow.
And that's always been the way I've approached it. My idea was I wanted to do a book that would be something I would want to buy as a Beatles fan.
Collect.
Yeah.
Philosophy. And a few years after I'd done a few books, the New York Times did a major story that Alan Kozin wrote, how some of the best Beatle books that were coming out were books that were self-published because people were doing them as a labor of love.
Yeah.
The other story, well, a few more, I love going to Beatle Fest. It's best for Beatle fans.
It's like a family reunion, isn't it?
It is. And the New Jersey one would be fun because inevitably somebody from one of the major publishers would come by and look through my books. And one guy looked through and he said, I don't mean this as an insult. He says, but your books are kind of like a yearbook. And I laughed and I said, well, I was photography editor for my high school yearbook for 2 years.
Funny.
He says, your layouts are very neat. They're not cluttered. And he says, they just chronologically. And when I do the book, it's kind of like asking someone, like if you were to ask Paul, do you write the music first or the lyrics first?
Right.
And he might say, well, sometimes I do the music first or sometimes, but sometimes I do them both at the same time.
Wow.
It's the same way when I write a book. I might do some of the writing first. I might separately gather some images and do some layouts. But on the new books, pretty much like these, the books here in this album series,
right.
a lot of times I do a little bit of writing, but for the most part, I'm sitting behind the computer in InDesign, and I'm writing and laying out the book at the exact same time.
Wow.
And I find that it achieves what I want to achieve with those books. I'm lazy. When I'm reading a book, I don't want to read something, and it says that it, see page such and such to see that image, and I'm flipping back. In my book, almost every time you read about something, the image of that is on the same page or on the opposite page in a 2-page spread. And I work very hard to make that happen. And a lot of times someone might say, you left out that little fact there. How come that isn't in that chapter? And I said, it wouldn't fit. Like, it wouldn't fit. I'm like, it wouldn't fit. I've got this much text and an image there, and it wouldn't fit.
Right.
And that's kind of the way I've been doing those books. And, I just find it to be fun that way.
And so you have a box set or, a packaged up set right now, don't you?
Yeah, Steve had this, and this has the first 4 books in the album series in paperback in that box set, which is really, a really good deal.
Yep.
And, and that's been fun because I found that the hardcover and the paperback market are in some ways separate markets because, the collectors and the people who have been buying all my books want the hardcover. The paperback, other people say, well, that'll be fine. And then there are other people that say, my hardcover books are in pristine condition, and I want to get the paperback books because I can thumb through them more and I won't worry about it. So many people I know have bought both of those. And, it's been great working with Steve on it. And, I've enjoyed it. I've been very fortunate because you meet wonderful people, such as meeting you all, through Beatle conventions and the like. That's really bad. And someone's asking, I missed the beginning. Will I be at the fest? Yes, I will be at the New Jersey Fest. And I will be giving a talk on my most current book, which is The Beatles, A Hard Day's Night and More. And the presentation I give on that is a really fun presentation with film clips, audio clips, tons of images and the fun stories. And what I do in that presentation is I kind of give people an idea of, how A Hard Day's Night became the great film that it was.
Right.
And show that, the perfect group of people were put together by United Artists with Walter Shenson as producer, making the right decisions, getting Alan Owen to do the screenplay, getting Richard Lester to direct it. In some of the clips that I show, and they were put together by a buddy of mine I met through Beatle Fest, Steve Shorten, who used to do the video room at the fest, wonderful guy. And I had him make some video clips from me from a film that was in the UK called It's Trad Dad. And why is that film so important? It's a type of film that John Lennon in 1963 in the summer said the Beatles were offered these types of films and would never do. And that was a film with some silly little plot with about 20 different bands, each playing a song or two. And John said, we don't want to be a part of that. We're only going to do a film when we find something that we think the teenagers will enjoy too.
Right.
They waited. Now, why would I want clips from It's Trad Dad? Because the director of It's Trad Dad was Richard Lester. In these clips of showing musical groups performing, you see tricks and techniques that he used in A Hard Day's Night.
I think.
And so that's why I use those clips. And, when people are seeing that, I've had a lot of people come up to me afterwards and go, I had no idea. So it's just a fun part of the story.
Yeah. We just rewatched Hard Day's Night again over the holidays. And my husband.
What did you see differently that you'd never seen before? Well, I always see something new. It's amazing.
Well, I've only probably seen it 3 times in my life. I saw it twice as a child, and then it just wasn't available. I don't own a copy, so I will
tell you a funny story that I mentioned in the foreword to the Hard Day's Night, not the foreword, kind of an intro section that I wrote, and that was I was on a climbing trip, was this Mount Kilimanjaro? No, this was the Inca Trail. So we're going to the Inca Trail, and on it there were these 2 college-age girls, and one of their fathers had put the trip together, and he said to them, Bruce has written a couple of books on the Beatles. So they were looking forward to meeting with me, and we started on the Inca Trail. And the first day we're moving along, and it's not that hard. It gets a lot harder each day. But that first day we're at low altitude, or more or less, and moving along. And one of them says, Bruce, do you want to do A Hard Day's Night? And I was thinking, maybe they want to sing some songs from A Hard Day or whatever. And they started doing the dialogue from the film. They had the entire film memorized.
Yeah.
Now, we couldn't have done that because we saw it in the movie theater once or twice.
Right.
But one of them had the DVD of the film and watched it so many times with her friend that the 2 of them had it memorized. And I couldn't keep up with them the whole film. I knew bits and pieces, of course.
Right.
Yeah,
it was fascinating. So on the Inca Trail up to Machu Picchu, here we are doing the film A Hard Day's Night.
That's hilarious.
The impact that film made on some people.
Yeah, what I saw, or what Martin and I saw when we watched it again recently, was just almost an immersive art piece of a day in the life of just how crazy it was inside the goldfish.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly what it was meant to be, a fictional documentary, or a rockumentary, as they would say today.
Yeah.
But the crazy thing about it was so much of it was true.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
because Alan Owen, he had gone and spent a couple of days with the Beatles in Scotland to see what the insanity was all about.
Yeah.
So for that reason, that's why it came out that way.
Yes.
Once again, you had a case of a brilliant producer, Walter Shenson, putting together the right writer, the right director, and the right cast to be with the Beatles. I mean, Wilford Bell was brilliant as Paul's fictional grandfather. We can let the cat out the bag. That really wasn't his grandfather, was it?
No.
Oh, no. He was a clean old man, though.
My father was quite.
Yeah, that joke. We laugh at that. You and I are on the in on that, and I didn't know that in America. They had the line of, he's a clean old man. Well, the funny thing about it was William Bramwell was in a show in the UK called Steptoe and Son,
That's right.
where he literally played a dirty old man.
Yes,
In the U.S., the equivalent of that, and what it was based on, was Sanford and Son was based on Steptoe and Son.
That's right.
So it would be imagining Red Fox, who was this very colorful comedian who used a lot of colorful words. It'd be like someone calling Red Fox, oh, he's a clean old man. We would find that very funny because he's not.
No,
Yeah,
anything
absolutely.
past, yeah.
And my father, Jimmy Mack, found it quite insulting because Jim was my dad was so fastidious. We could only have white sheets, white pillowcases, white towels,
White table linen,
white
everything,
table linen, clear drinking glasses because he wanted to see if he could see the germs. He was in by no means OCD or a germaphobe or anything. He'd shake your hand and give you a kiss on the cheek, but they used to take the piss behind his back and say, oh, Uncle Mr. Clean. Uncle Jim was Mr. Clean. And so this film comes out and they're calling the character playing my dad's father, clean old man. And my dad was just nothing.
He used to sniff when he wasn't happy.
And I saw one of the comments, someone said they had recently watched Help. I've watched Help a bunch of times lately, working on the latest book. And the great thing about Help, if you want to do a fun double feature to get the idea where some of the ideas from Help came from, watch the James Bond film Goldfinger first. There are some wonderful parodies in it of Goldfinger. First of all, some of the music is very John Barry, James Bondish. But there's a scene everybody remembers, Odd Job, when he takes off his turban, he flicks it and it cuts the girl's head.
Yeah.
So in Help, one of Klang's henchmen is wearing a scarf around his head, and he takes off the scarf and goes to toss it at someone. And of course, it just hits the floor. So the chef in the kitchen bends over to pick up the scarf, and of course, he knocks him over the head with the frying pan. You've got stuff like that.
Yeah.
That are cute little parodies. James Bond, his car, the Aston Martin DB5, lets out a smoke screen in an oil slick. In the Harrods truck that Klang has commandeered, when he goes to drive off, it puts carpet tracks down in the street. So there are a lot of these clever little parodies.
Parodies, yeah.
And in my book, one of the chapters in the book is by a guy named Frank Daniels, who compares, the Bond in the Beatles things. And I did want to mention in all my books in the album series, and I'm very proud of this, it's a 9-book series, 9th book coming out this summer. I've had the exact same, not only the same, graphic designer as Diana Thornton is in all my books, but the same prime contributors. And that is from Beatle Fan Magazine, its editor-publisher, Bill King, Al Sussman, who writes wonderful pieces, Piers Hemmingson's writing the Canadian chapter, and also Frank Daniels, either writing about films or some esoteric topic, because Frank is, after all, a university professor and a really incredible collector of all sorts of things, like not just Beatles, but comic books, cookbooks, and God knows what else.
Oh,
fantastic.
Wonderful guy. So I have this great creative team that I work with.
Great.
And it's just been, you can't do it. It'd be like an attorney trying a really big lawsuit by himself. Of course, he has a paralegal, a secretary, maybe several associates working with him. So when I do these books, that's why on the book I say compiled by me. Right. Yes, I wrote many of the chapters myself. Yes, I edit all the chapters. But I got a great team working with me on all these books.
please cordially invite any or all of them to be our guest on TeaFlix and talk about their whole experience. We'd love to have them in front of our Beatle.
Sorry, Ruth, I did try to reach out to Al Sussman.
Oh, yeah. Al's got like 2 chapters in the past couple of books where he writes what was going on in the world, putting it into proper perspective, and also what was going on in music at that time. In the new book that's coming out this summer, Al goes out on a limb, and I don't disagree with him, where he calls 1965 the greatest year in rock and roll music. And I don't dispute that for a second.
Wow.
Interesting.
I'd have to go back and look at all the records, because I would be 5 years old. So, I'd have to go back and look at all of that. But that's given me a little research project. I would love to do that. Mm-hmm. So our viewers can find you at beatle.net.
Yeah. And that's like it's just beatle.net, N-E-T. Just like it sounds, no double T in it. It's
no double T's. No.
And then if you want the special for the paperback collection in the slipcover, like from Imagine and Wonder, like Stephen put our
this area, you go to Imagine and Wonder.
ImagineandWonder.com or Golden Age 60s has got a lot of interesting Golden Age 60s.com. So go bookmark all of those. And you will possibly remember from last time, Bruce, but our regular viewers know that we always have a limerick for our very special guests.
Right. You get 2 limericks because you've been on the show.
You get 2 verses because you're a second-time guest. So.
And they're going to be 2 different verses, or is it going to be like Herman Hermits sang in Henry VIII and say second verse same as the first?
No. Slightly different.
No.
Here we go. And a 1, 2, 3. Dear Bruce is an author so fine, with details his works intertwine. He digs up the lore on our lovely Fab Four, preserving their legend all time.
Second verse.
There once was a taxman named Bruce, whose love for the Beatles broke loose. From research to shows, his knowledge just grows, a Fab Four resource of great use. Ta-da!
Thank you very much.
Bruce. It was wonderful. Fascinating stuff.
Did we pass the audition?
You passed the audition.
Oh, jolly good.
That was great. So everyone check out, Bruce will be live and in person at the New Jersey Beatle Fest at the end of March. He is at beatle.net, imagineandwonder.com, and also Golden Age 60s. So ta-da, and thank you all for tuning in. Share and share away. This will be on our YouTube channel later on McCartney.com. It will be on the front page in a couple of hours on the McCartney Times, and spread around the world as an audio podcast as soon as Buzzsprout does their thing on Pandora and Spotify and Apple Music and all the rest.
All right.
So, thanks for tuning in, kids.
Bruce.
We love you lots, and we'll see you all of a sudden.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in to TeaFlix, and check out Dr. Angie's books, Organic Teas and CBD, at mrsmccartneysteas.com. Toodle pip.